Hello there, and welcome back to another journey through the mists of history and legend. Tonight we're traveling to the windswept fjords of Scandinavia, to an age when longships carved through northern seas and the name Viking struck fear into the hearts of kingdoms across Europe. This is the story of Björn Ironside, a warrior whose name echoes through the centuries, a raider whose ambitions took him further than most Vikings dared to dream, and a king whose legacy would shape the future of Sweden itself. Grab something warm to drink, settle in somewhere comfortable, and let the world outside fade away for a while. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or simply seeking a quiet escape, you're in the right place. And if this kind of storytelling brings you peace, feel free to like the video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. There's something strangely comforting about knowing others are out there, sharing this same quiet moment across the world. So dim the lights, close your eyes if you wish, and let's begin. Picture, if you will, the northern reaches of Europe in the 9th century. The year is somewhere around 845, give or take a few winters. The landscape is harsh and beautiful in equal measure, towering mountains cloaked in snow, deep fjords cutting into rocky coastlines, and forests so thick and ancient they seem to belong to another world entirely. This is Scandinavia, the homeland of the Norsemen, the people we've come to call Vikings. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing on a rocky shore in Norway or Denmark or Sweden. The air is cold and clean, carrying the scent of pine and salt water. Behind you rise mountains, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds. Before you stretches the sea, grey-green and restless, extending to a horizon that seems impossibly far away. This is where it begins. This is where the Viking story starts. The climate in 9th century Scandinavia was actually slightly warmer than it had been in previous centuries, part of what's known as the medieval warm period. This meant longer growing seasons, which paradoxically may have contributed to population growth that then put pressure on available farmland. More people needed more resources, and Scandinavia, while beautiful, has never been an easy place to eke out a living. The soil in much of Norway is thin and rocky. Sweden has better farmland in its southern regions, but the northern reaches are covered in endless forests. Denmark, the most agricultural of the three, still faced limitations. In a society where land meant wealth and inheritance usually went to the eldest son, younger sons found themselves with few options. They could stay home and work their older brother's land. They could try to clear new ground from the forest, a back-breaking task. Or they could take to the sea. And oh, what a sea it was. The Baltic, the North Sea, the Norwegian Sea. These were the highways of the Viking world. Where other cultures saw barriers, the Vikings saw opportunities. Their ships, those magnificent longships and the broader nars used for trading, were marvels of engineering. Shallow drafted, they could navigate both open ocean and shallow rivers. Fast and maneuverable, they could outrun most other vessels of the time. Light enough to be carried overland when necessary, they opened up routes that seemed impossible to other cultures. But who were these Vikings really? The word itself, Viking, likely comes from the Old Norse vikingur, which may have meant pirate or raider. Though they're often remembered primarily as warriors and plunderers, that's only part of the story. The Vikings were also farmers, traders, craftsmen and explorers. They were poets and lawmakers, shipbuilders and navigators. Their society was complex, their culture rich, and their influence on the medieval world profound. Viking society was divided into three main classes. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves who had no rights and could be bought and sold like any other property. Most thralls were captives taken in raids, though some were born into slavery or had sold themselves to pay off debts. Life as a thrall was hard and often short. Above the thralls were the carls, free men who owned land and had full protection under the law. Most Vikings were carls. They were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, traders. They could own property, participate in the thing or assembly where laws were made and disputes settled, and serve as warriors when called upon. Being a carl meant having dignity and rights, even if you weren't wealthy. At the top of society were the jarls, the nobles and chieftains. These were wealthy men who owned large estates, commanded the loyalty of many carls, and led in both war and peace. A successful jarl might become a king, though in the early Viking age, king often just meant a particularly powerful chieftain, rather than a ruler in the medieval European sense. Later in the Viking Age, a fourth class emerged, kings and queens who ruled over larger territories and commanded the allegiance of multiple jarls. But in Björn's time, the 9th century, Scandinavia was still a patchwork of smaller kingdoms and chiefdoms, constantly shifting as alliances formed and broke, as ambitious men rose and fell. The Viking Age, as historians call it, stretched roughly from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century. It began with the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793, an attack so shocking that it was recorded in chronicles across Christendom. That raid was, in many ways, a warning of things to come. For the next 2.5 centuries, Viking longships would appear on coastlines from North America to the Middle East, from the British Isles to the rivers of Russia. That first raid on Lindisfarne deserves a moment of our attention, because it set the pattern for so much of what followed. The monastery sat on a small tidal island off the northeast coast of England. It was a centre of Christian learning and culture, home to monks who spent their days in prayer, study, and the creation of beautiful illuminated manuscripts. It was also completely undefended. On a summer day in 793, Viking ships appeared off the coast. The monks, who had no experience with raiders, probably didn't even realize the danger until it was too late. The Vikings landed, stormed the monastery, and took everything of value. They killed some monks, took others as slaves, and destroyed what they couldn't carry. Then they sailed away, leaving behind a traumatized community and a warning that echoed across Europe. Nowhere was safe. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written decades later, recorded the event with a mix of horror and religious interpretation. The chronicler wrote of terrible portents that preceded the raid, great whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons seen flying in the air. Of course, these portents were probably added after the fact, a way of making sense of something that seemed senseless. But the shock was real. These northern pagans had attacked one of the holiest sites in England and gotten away with it. What drove these Norsemen from their homes? The reasons were many and varied. Population pressure played a role. Scandinavia, while beautiful, had limited arable land, and younger sons often found themselves with few prospects at home. There was also the lure of wealth. Monasteries and churches across Europe were filled with gold, silver, and precious objects, often undefended or lightly guarded. To a Viking warrior, these were tempting targets indeed. Consider the economics of it. A successful raid might bring back silver weighing hundreds of pounds, along with fine textiles, jewelry, weapons, and slaves. Divided among a ship's crew of 40 or 50 men, this could represent years of normal farming income. And if you survived, if you built up a reputation as a successful raider, you could attract more followers for larger expeditions. Success bred more success. But it wasn't just about material gain. In Norse culture, reputation mattered enormously. A man's worth was measured not just in the wealth he accumulated, but in the deeds he performed and the stories told about him after death. Glory in battle, cunning in strategy, generosity to one's followers, these were the qualities that made a man legendary. And for many young Vikings, the only way to achieve such glory was to sail beyond the horizon, to test themselves against the unknown. The concept of honor in Viking society was complex and unforgiving. A man who allowed an insult to pass unavenged was seen as weak. A man who broke his sworn oath became an outcast, a nithing, barely human. But a man who kept his word, who was generous with his wealth, who fought bravely and sought glory, that man would be remembered. His name would live on in stories and songs. His descendants would speak of him with pride. The Vikings also had a profound belief in fate, in the idea that each person's destiny was woven by the Norns, supernatural beings who determined the course of every life. This belief could make them fearless. If your death was already decided, why not embrace danger? Why not seek out the greatest challenges? And if you fell in battle, well, that was the best death a warrior could hope for. You'd be carried to Valhalla by the Valkyries, where you'd feast and fight alongside the heroes of old until the final battle at Ragnarok. Valhalla, Odin's great hall, was the ultimate destination for a Viking warrior. The Norse believed that those who died bravely in battle would be chosen by the Valkyries, warrior women who served Odin, and taken to Valhalla. There the warriors would spend their days fighting, perfecting their skills, and their nights feasting on boar meat and drinking mead. Each morning, those who had died in the previous day's practice battle would rise again, whole and unharmed, ready to fight once more. This wasn't seen as empty or pointless. The warriors were training for Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when they would fight alongside Odin and the other gods against the forces of chaos and destruction. They would lose. The myths made that clear. The world would burn and be reborn, but they would go down fighting, and there was honor in that. Not all warriors went to Valhalla, though. The goddess Freyja had her own hall, Folkvanga, where she claimed half of those slain in battle. And those who died of sickness or old age, the straw death, as it was contemptuously called, went to Hel, a cold and shadowy realm far less appealing than Valhalla's golden halls. This worldview shaped everything about Viking warrior culture. It made them aggressive, even reckless at times. It made them value courage above almost all other virtues, and it made them formidable enemies, because a warrior who truly believes that death in battle is glorious is very difficult to intimidate. But Viking culture wasn't all warfare and raiding. At home, in the long houses scattered across the Scandinavian countryside, life revolved around family, farming, and community. The basic unit of Viking society was the household, headed by a householder who was responsible for everyone living under his roof: wife, children, elderly parents, perhaps some unmarried siblings, and thralls. Viking houses in the 9th century were typically long rectangular buildings with walls of wood or turf, and roofs thatched with straw or covered with turf. Inside, there would be a central hearth for cooking and warmth, platforms along the walls for sleeping and working, and storage areas for food and supplies. In winter, when the days were short and the weather harsh, the family would spend much of their time indoors, spinning wool, repairing tools, telling stories, and generally maintaining the household. Women in Viking society had more rights and freedom than their counterparts in many other medieval cultures. They could own property, inherit wealth, and divorce their husbands if they had cause. A woman managed the household when her husband was away, which in the case of a raider or trader might be months or even years. She controlled the keys to the storerooms, managed the thralls, oversaw the farm work, and made important decisions about the household's resources. Some women even took up arms. The evidence for female Viking warriors, the so-called shield maidens, is controversial among historians. There are graves where women have been buried with weapons, particularly in Scandinavia. The most famous is the so-called Birka warrior woman, found with a full set of military equipment including a sword, axe, spear, arrows, and 2 horses. For a long time, archaeologists assumed this must be a man, but DNA analysis confirmed the skeleton was female. Does this mean there were many female warriors? Probably not. But it suggests that the possibility existed, that exceptional women could take on roles usually reserved for men. And in the sagas and mythology, shield maidens appear regularly. Lagertha, Ragnar's first wife in some versions of his story, was said to be a skilled warrior. Brynhild, the Valkyrie, was a warrior woman. These stories reflected, if not widespread practice, at least cultural acceptance of the idea. This was the world into which Björn Ironside was born. A world of opportunity and peril, of honor and violence, of long ships and legends. A world where a farmer might become a raider might become a king, and a king's deeds might echo through the centuries in song and story. To understand Björn, we must first understand his father. Or rather, we must try to understand him, because Ragnar Lothbrok stands at that curious intersection where history and legend blur into something almost indistinguishable. He looms over the entire 9th century like a great shadow, cast partly by reality and partly by the fires of imagination. Was there a real Ragnar Lothbrok? Most historians believe so, though they'll quickly add qualifiers and cautions. Contemporary sources from the 9th century mention Viking leaders with names like Reginherus, Ragnall, and Ragnar. The Frankish annals of Saint Bertin, written by monks who lived through the Viking raids, describe a chieftain named Reginherus, who led a devastating attack on Paris in 845. He besieged the city with a fleet of 120 ships, and King Charles the Bald was forced to pay him an enormous ransom, £7,000 of silver, to make him leave. Let's pause there for a moment and consider what that means. 7,000 pounds of silver. In the 9th century, that was an absolutely staggering sum. It represented years of tax revenue from one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe. To put it in perspective, a single pound of silver could buy several cows or feed a family for months. 7,000 pounds could outfit entire armies, build castles, fund monasteries. And Charles handed it over to this Viking chieftain just to make him go away. The siege of Paris in 845 was a masterclass in Viking tactics. Reginherus, whoever he was, didn't just sail up to the walls and start attacking. He positioned his fleet strategically, cutting off the city from resupply. He demonstrated that he had the patience and resources to sit there as long as necessary. He made it clear that he could and would destroy Paris if he chose to, and when Charles finally agreed to pay, Reginherus took the silver and left, probably laughing all the way back to Denmark or wherever he called home. This Reginherus might have been Ragnar, or he might have been one of several Viking leaders whose stories became intertwined over the centuries. Because by the time Icelandic scribes were writing down the sagas in the 13th century, 400 years after the events they described, Ragnar had become something more than a man. He'd become a legend, a composite figure who embodied the ideal Viking warrior king. Think about it this way. Imagine if, 400 years from now, people started writing down stories about the great leaders of our time. But they were working from oral traditions that had been passed down through generations, changed and embellished with each telling, mixed up with similar stories about similar people. How accurate would those accounts be? They might preserve some kernel of truth, some memory of real events, but the details would be hopelessly tangled. That's essentially what we're dealing with when we try to understand Ragnar Lothbrok. The sagas give us vivid, detailed accounts of his life, but they were written centuries after he lived by people working in a very different cultural context, for audiences who wanted entertainment as much as information. The line between history and story had become blurred, perhaps deliberately so. The earliest written mention of Ragnar comes from an Irish text called the Fragmentary Annals of Ireland, written in the 11th century. It mentions a figure called Ragnar, who had 3 sons and was expelled from his homeland. 2 of these sons later conducted a raid into the Mediterranean. Sound familiar? This could be referring to Björn's expedition, which would make this Ragnar the same as Ragnar. Or it could be a completely different person whose story got confused with Ragnar's over time. The first extensive account of Ragnar's life comes from Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish historian writing around the year 1200. His work, the Gesta Danorum, or Deeds of the Danes, is a massive history of Denmark, from its legendary origins up to Saxo's own time. It's written in Latin and draws on both historical sources and oral traditions. Saxo portrays Ragnar as a Danish king and warrior who performed many great deeds. But Saxo's work is notoriously difficult to parse. He includes obviously mythological elements right alongside what seem to be historical events. He has Ragnar fighting in battles that probably never happened, conquering territories that don't match any known historical conquests, and generally being far more successful and powerful than any single 9th century Viking chieftain could realistically have been. Still, there are elements in Saxo's account that feel grounded in reality. The politics, the warfare, the social customs, these all ring true to what we know about the Viking Age. And some of the people Ragnar interacts with in Saxo's telling were real historical figures. So there's something there, some historical core, but it's wrapped in layers of legend and literary embellishment. The sagas tell us that Ragnar was the son of Sigurdring, a king of Denmark and Sweden. They tell us he earned his nickname Lothbrok, meaning hairy breeches or shaggy pants, when he wore special protective trousers made of boiled animal hide to fight a giant serpent that was guarding a princess named Thora. The story goes like this. There was a Swedish jarl, a noble, who gave his young daughter Thora a small snake as a gift. She kept it as a pet, but being a magical creature, it grew and grew until it was enormous, coiled around her bower, too dangerous to approach. The jarl, perhaps realizing his gift had gotten out of hand, declared that any man who could kill the serpent could have his daughter's hand in marriage. Many tried. All failed. The dragon, for it had essentially become a dragon by this point, was too large, too fierce, too venomous. Its breath alone was said to be poisonous. Anyone who got close enough to strike at it would be overcome by the toxic fumes. Young Ragnar heard about this challenge and decided to try his luck. But unlike the others, he didn't just charge in with sword and courage. He was clever. He had special clothing made, trousers and a coat of thick leather or fur that he then boiled in pitch, creating a protective layer that he hoped would resist both the serpent's fangs and its poisonous breath. Thus armored, he confronted the beast. The battle was fierce. The serpent struck at him again and again, but its fangs couldn't penetrate the pitch-hardened clothes. Ragnar struck back with his spear, finding the weak spots in the creature's scales, until finally he dealt a killing blow. The serpent died, and Ragnar won the princess. People started calling him Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar Hairy Breeches, because of those distinctive protective garments. The name stuck for the rest of his life. It's a wonderfully vivid story, the kind of tale that would be told and retold around hearthfires on long winter nights. Is it true? Almost certainly not, at least not literally. There weren't actual dragons in 9th century Sweden. But it might preserve a memory of something real, some dangerous task Ragnar accomplished that was later mythologized into a dragon slaying. He married Thora, and they were happy together, or so the saga says. They had 2 sons, Agnar and Eric, but Thora's happiness was short-lived. She died young from illness, the saga suggests, leaving Ragnar bereft. He threw himself into his duties as a king and warrior, trying to forget his grief in action and conquest. Time passed. Ragnar's reputation grew. He led successful raids, expanded his territory, and proved himself a capable ruler. But he was lonely, or perhaps just ready to marry again for political and practical reasons. A king needed heirs, needed alliances, needed a woman to manage his household when he was away at war or on raids. So arrangements were made. Ragnar was to marry the daughter of Eystein Belli, who was king of parts of Sweden. It would be a good match, politically advantageous, the kind of marriage that made sense for a king. The preparations began. But fate, as the Vikings believed, had other plans. Now Aslog's story is remarkable in its own right, and it's worth telling in some detail, because it shows how the sagas wove together different legendary cycles into a connected narrative. According to the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, she was the daughter of the legendary hero Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and the Valkyrie Brynhild. If you know anything about Germanic mythology, you'll recognize these names. Sigurd killed the dragon Fafnir and claimed the cursed treasure it guarded. He met Brynhild, a Valkyrie who'd been put to sleep by Odin as punishment for disobedience, woke her and fell in love with her. Their story is tragic and complicated, involving magic, betrayal, and death. In the saga, Sigurd and Brynhild have a daughter, Aslaug. When the child is only 3 years old, both her parents die in the violent, tragic ways the legends describe. Aslaug is alone in the world, an orphaned princess with royal blood, but no protection. A poor couple find her and decide to raise her as their own, but they're worried. If people discover that this child is the daughter of the famous Sigurd and Brynhild, someone might try to kidnap her, claim her, or kill her to prevent her from making claims to power. So they hide her identity. They give her a new name, Kraka, meaning crow. They dress her in rough clothes and let her run wild, making her look like any other peasant child. Years pass. Aslaug grows up in Norway in this humble household, unaware of her true heritage, or perhaps aware but unable to do anything about it. She's beautiful, the saga tells us, but also clever and perceptive in ways that set her apart from ordinary folk. One day Ragnar and his men land on the Norwegian coast during their travels. They're probably raiding or trading. The saga isn't entirely clear. While the men are ashore, some of them encounter a young woman so striking that they can't stop staring. This is Aslaug, though they don't know her name yet. She's working in the fields or washing clothes by a stream, depending on which version of the story you read. And even in her rough peasant clothes, her beauty shines through. The men return to Ragnar and tell him about this remarkable woman. He's intrigued. He sends for her, perhaps thinking she'd make a good concubine or servant. But when Aslaug arrives, Ragnar is struck not just by her beauty, but by her bearing, her intelligence, the way she speaks and carries herself. This is no ordinary peasant girl. They talk. And Aslaug, wise beyond her years, engages Ragnar in a battle of wits. In some versions of the story, he sets her a riddle or a challenge, asking her to come to him neither clothed nor unclothed, neither fasting nor feasting, neither alone nor in company. It's the kind of impossible task that kings in fairy tales are always setting, and Aslaug solves it brilliantly. She comes dressed in a fishing net, having taken a bite of an onion, with a dog at her side. Neither clothed nor unclothed, neither fasting nor feasting, neither alone nor in company. Ragnar is delighted. Here's a woman who can match him in cleverness. He forgets all about his planned marriage to Eystein's daughter. He wants Aslaug instead. But there's still the matter of her parentage. Ragnar had been planning to marry royalty. He can't very well call off that wedding to marry a peasant girl, no matter how clever or beautiful. Aslaug understands this, and so, at the right moment, she reveals who she really is. She's not Kraka the peasant girl. She's Aslaug, daughter of Sigurd and Brynhild, descended from gods and heroes. Her bloodline is as good as or better than that of any Swedish princess. Whether Ragnar believes her immediately or needs convincing, the saga doesn't entirely make clear, but he chooses to accept her claim. They marry, and together they have sons. The sagas and different historical sources give varying numbers and names, but the most commonly mentioned are 5. Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, Hvitserk, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and sometimes Rognvald or Ubba, depending on which source you consult. Each of these sons had his own distinctive traits, his own nickname, his own destiny. Ivar the Boneless, despite his odd epithet which has never been satisfactorily explained, was the most cunning and ruthless. Sigurd Snake in the Eye was named for a peculiar mark in his eye that resembled a serpent, biting its own tail. Hvitserk's name meant white shirt, and Björn, of course, was Ironside, the one whose strength and resilience seemed almost supernatural. These sons would become as famous as their father, if not more so. Each would lead raids and conquests across Europe. Each would carve out his own legend. Together, they would form the core of what became known as the Great Heathen Army, the massive Viking force that invaded England in 865. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Before the sons could make their mark, the father had to meet his end. Ragnar's story, as the sagas tell it, ends in tragedy. But it's a tragedy born of pride, of the very qualities that had made him great. After years of successful raiding and ruling, after building a reputation that stretched across the known world, Ragnar found himself facing an enemy he couldn't defeat: the accomplishments of his own sons. His boys had grown into formidable warriors and leaders in their own right. They led their own raids, commanded their own ships, won their own victories, and the skalds, the poets and storytellers, began singing more about the sons than the father. People were talking about Ivar's cunning, about Björn's strength, about the great deeds the younger generation was accomplishing. For a proud man like Ragnar, this must have been difficult to bear. The sagas portray it as jealousy, pure and simple. He couldn't stand the idea that his sons might overshadow him, might achieve greater fame than he had. He needed to prove that the old boar still had tusks, that Ragnar Lothbrok was still the greatest Viking of them all. So he made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He appointed Eystein Belli, that Swedish king whose daughter he'd once been engaged to, as a kind of regent or co-ruler over Sweden. This freed Ragnar to go raiding again, but not just any raid. He wanted something spectacular, something that would remind everyone of his greatness. He decided to invade England. Specifically, he chose to attack Northumbria, one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that made up what would eventually become England. And here's where the pride comes in. He decided to do it with just 2 ships. 2 ships. Think about that. We talked earlier about the Great Heathen Army setting out with possibly thousands of warriors in dozens of ships. Ragnar himself, in his earlier raids, would have commanded fleets of many vessels. But now, in what seems to have been a fit of arrogance, or perhaps a desire to prove he didn't need a huge force to achieve great things, he set sail for England with maybe 80 to 100 men total. It's the kind of decision that makes sense only if you believe completely in your own legend, in your own invincibility. And perhaps Ragnar did believe it. He'd succeeded so many times before. He'd defeated larger forces, outwitted stronger enemies, survived impossible situations. Why not one more time? The crossing from Scandinavia to England can be treacherous. The North Sea is not a friendly body of water. Storms can arise with little warning, turning calm seas into towering waves in a matter of hours. And Ragnar's luck, which had held for so long, finally ran out. The sagas describe a terrible storm that caught his tiny fleet off the coast of Northumbria. The ships were battered, damaged. Perhaps one was lost entirely. When Ragnar and his surviving men finally made it to shore, they were in bad shape. Their ships were wrecked or badly damaged. Their supplies were lost or ruined. They were wet, exhausted, and far from home with no easy way to get back. And waiting for them was King Aella of Northumbria. Now Aella was a real historical figure. We know he ruled Northumbria around this time, in the mid to late 860s. We know he died in battle against the Vikings in 867. But whether he actually encountered Ragnar, whether he's really the one who killed him, that's less certain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is generally quite reliable about such things, doesn't mention Ragnar at all. It talks about Viking raids and battles, but not this specific incident. Still, the saga account is vivid and compelling. Ragnar and his bedraggled crew, what was left of them, were in no condition to fight a proper battle. But they tried anyway, because what else could they do? They were Vikings, warriors, sons of the North. They would go down fighting. The Northumbrians overwhelmed them. It wasn't even close. Ragnar's men were cut down, and Ragnar himself was captured alive. And here, Aella had a choice. He could ransom this famous Viking chieftain back to his people. He could execute him quickly and be done with it, or he could make an example of him. He chose the last option. According to the saga, Aella had a pit dug and filled it with venomous snakes. Then he had Ragnar thrown in. The great Viking king, who had conquered cities and terrified kingdoms, died in agony from hundreds of snake bites, slowly and painfully. As the serpents bit him again and again, as the venom coursed through his body, and he felt his life ebbing away, Ragnar allegedly spoke his final words. Different versions of the saga give slightly different phrasings, but the meaning is the same. How the little pigs will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered. He was talking about his sons, of course. The little pigs were Ivar, Björn, Hvitserk, Sigurd, and the others. And Ragnar was predicting, correctly as it turned out, that when his sons learned of his death and the manner of it, they would be enraged. They would seek vengeance. They would make Aella and all of Northumbria pay for what had been done to their father. It's a powerful image, a defiant warrior mocking his executioner even in the moment of death, promising retribution from beyond the grave. Whether Ragnar actually said these words, whether any of this actually happened as the saga describes, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that in 865, just a few years after Ragnar's supposed death, a massive Viking army landed in England. And among its leaders were men who claimed to be Ragnar's sons. They came for revenge, they said. They came to make King Aella pay, and they succeeded. Now, how much of this is true? It's hard to say. King Aella of Northumbria was a real person who ruled around 866. The method of Ragnar's execution, the snake pit, appears in multiple saga sources, but no contemporary English or Frankish chronicle mentions it. The blood eagle, another gruesome method of execution that the sagas claim was performed on King Aella in revenge, is similarly absent from reliable historical sources. Some historians think the whole snake pit story might be a later invention, a way of making Ragnar's death more dramatic and memorable. Others think it might preserve a kernel of truth, even if the details have been exaggerated. The Vikings did sometimes execute important captives in unusual or particularly cruel ways, pour encourager les autres, as the French would say, to discourage others. And there's something poetic about Ragnar dying from snake bites, given that his first great deed, according to legend, was killing a dragon or giant serpent, killed by what he once killed. It's the kind of symmetry that storytellers love, which makes it suspect as history but powerful as narrative. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: there were Viking leaders in the mid-9th century who raided successfully across Western Europe. At least some of them may have been related. Their sons formed what came to be known as the Great Heathen Army and invaded England in 865. And one of those sons was named Björn. Björn Ironside was born sometime in the early to mid-9th century, probably between 840 and 845. The sagas don't give us an exact date, and why would they? The Vikings didn't keep birth records the way we do today. Time was measured by seasons and significant events, not by numbered years on a calendar. His mother was Aslaug, that prophetic daughter of legendary heroes, descended from dragon slayers and Valkyries. His father was Ragnar Lothbrok, whether we understand him as a single historical figure or as a legendary composite. And Björn had brothers, formidable brothers, who would fight alongside him and sometimes against him in the years to come. Imagine being born into that family. From your very first breath, expectations would surround you like a cloak. You're the son of Ragnar Lothbrok, people would say. You have the blood of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer flowing through your veins. Your mother is descended from a Valkyrie. What great deeds will you accomplish? How will you prove yourself worthy of such lineage? It must have been both inspiring and intimidating. On one hand, you have this incredible legacy, these stories of amazing feats and legendary ancestors. On the other hand, how do you live up to that? How does any normal human being match the accomplishments of dragon slayers and Valkyries? The nickname Ironside is fascinating, and it tells us something important about how Björn must have approached this challenge. According to Saxo Grammaticus, writing in his Gesta Danorum in the 12th century, Björn earned this name during a battle when he fought alongside his father Ragnar against the Swedish king Sturla. The story goes like this. Ragnar and Sturla had a quarrel, as Viking kings often did. Rather than engage in a full-scale war that would cost many lives and much treasure, they agreed to settle their dispute through combat. Not single combat between the two kings themselves, though. That would be too simple. Instead, they'd each bring champions, and these champions would fight while the armies watched. Ragnar brought 3 of his sons, Björn, Fridleif, and Radbard. Sturla brought the renowned warrior Starkad and his 7 sons. Now, Starkad was no ordinary fighter. He appears in multiple Norse sagas as a legendary warrior, sometimes depicted as a giant or half-giant, blessed or cursed by the gods with extraordinary strength and a long life, but also destined to commit terrible deeds. In some versions, he has 6 arms, though other sources give him the normal complement of 2. So here's young Björn, probably still in his teens or early 20s, facing off against this legendary champion and his 7 sons. The odds were not in his favor, but Björn fought with extraordinary skill and ferocity. He moved through the battle like a force of nature, striking down enemies left and right, and remarkably, miraculously, he emerged from the combat without any serious wounds. Saxo writes that Björn inflicted great slaughter on the foe without hurt to himself, gained from the strength of his sides, which were like iron, a perpetual name. In other words, Björn fought so fiercely and sustained so few injuries that people believed his sides, his torso, must be made of iron. He was effectively invulnerable, or at least unusually resistant to harm. Now, whether this particular battle happened exactly as described is questionable. Starkad himself is a semi-legendary figure, and the whole story has the feel of a heroic tale rather than a historical account. But the nickname stuck, and it tells us something about how Björn was perceived. He was a warrior of exceptional skill and resilience, someone who could wade into the thick of combat and emerge unscathed. In a culture that revered martial prowess, that was high praise indeed. What did it take to become that kind of warrior? What was Björn's training like? We can piece together a picture from what we know about Viking childhood and the raising of boys in noble families. From a very young age, Björn would have been taught to fight. Not with real weapons at first, of course, but with wooden practice swords and blunted spears. Boys in Viking society started learning martial skills almost as soon as they could walk. They'd wrestle with each other, practice with weapons, learn to judge distance and timing, develop the reflexes that might one day save their lives in battle. As Björn grew older, the training would have become more serious and more dangerous. By his early teens, he'd be practicing with real weapons, though still under supervision. He'd learn not just how to swing a sword or thrust a spear, but how to use a shield effectively, how to move in armor, how to fight in different formations. Vikings didn't fight in the tightly disciplined ranks of Roman legions, but they did use shield walls and other tactical formations that required coordination and practice. But fighting wasn't the only skill a young Viking noble needed to learn. Björn would have been taught to sail, to read the stars and the sun for navigation, to understand winds and currents and tides. He'd learn about ship construction and maintenance, because a Viking who couldn't maintain his own vessel was useless on a raid or voyage. He'd learn about trade and negotiation, because successful raiders often became successful traders, and you needed to know how to strike a good bargain. He would have learned the stories of his ancestors and his people. The sagas weren't just entertainment. They were cultural education, teaching young Vikings about their history, their values, what it meant to be Norse. Björn would have listened to skalds recite the deeds of ancient heroes, tales of the gods, accounts of famous battles and raids. He'd memorized some of these himself, because a well-spoken man who could entertain his fellows with a good story was valued in Viking society. He'd learn about the gods too, about Odin and Thor and Freya, about the Nine Worlds and Yggdrasil, the World Tree, about the forces of chaos that constantly threaten order, about Ragnarok and what it would mean when the end finally came. Viking religion wasn't like Christianity, with formal services and priests giving sermons. It was more participatory, more personal. You made offerings to the gods when you needed their help. You invoked them before battle. You told stories about them to remind yourself and others of their power and lessons. Growing up in Ragnar's household would have meant training from a young age alongside his brothers. Ivar, Hvitserk, Sigurd, and the others would have been his companions, his rivals, his closest allies. They'd compete with each other constantly, because that's what brothers do, especially in a warrior culture. Who can throw a spear farther? Who's faster with a sword? Who can hold his breath longer underwater? Who can drink more ale without falling over? But they'd also learn to work together, because in a shield wall or a ship's crew, cooperation was essential. You needed to trust the man next to you, needed to know he'd protect your vulnerable side while you protected his. Brothers who'd trained together from childhood had an advantage that way. They knew each other's moves, could anticipate each other's actions, fought as a unit rather than as individuals. And beyond the physical and practical training, there was the less tangible education in being a leader. Björn would have watched his father rule, watched how Ragnar made decisions, settled disputes, rewarded loyalty, and punished betrayal. He'd learned that leadership wasn't just about being the best fighter, though that helped. It was about inspiring others to follow you, about knowing when to be generous and when to be firm, about balancing the competing interests of your followers and keeping them unified behind your goals. The sagas tell us that while Ragnar was still alive, his sons left his kingdom to seek their fortunes. According to the tale of Ragnar's sons, Björn and his brothers conquered Zealand, Rydgotaland, Gotland, Öland, and various smaller islands, while their father still ruled. They did this, the saga suggests, because they wanted to prove themselves, to show that they were worthy sons of a great father. Whether this happened exactly as the saga describes, we can't say. But the pattern makes sense. Viking culture had a custom, mentioned by several sources, of sending younger sons away from home once they came of age. The reasoning was practical. There wasn't enough land or resources for everyone to stay in one place. The eldest son would inherit the father's estate. Younger sons needed to make their own way in the world, but there was more to it than just economics. Leaving home was a rite of passage, a way of proving yourself. A young man who could gather a crew, outfit a ship, and return home laden with silver and glory, that man had shown he could survive on his own, that he deserved respect and status. He wasn't just someone's son anymore, he was his own man, a warrior and raider in his own right. For Björn, that meant raiding. It meant gathering a crew of men willing to follow him, men who trusted in his leadership and his luck. It meant outfitting at least one ship, probably more as he became more successful. And it meant sailing off to foreign shores to seek wealth and glory through plunder and conquest. He was good at it, very good at it. The sources, both contemporary and later, make that clear. Björn wasn't just another Viking raider. He was successful enough, renowned enough, that his name was remembered and recorded. And by the mid-850s, when he was probably in his late teens or early 20s, he was leading raids into one of the richest targets in Europe, the Frankish kingdoms. In 865, something unprecedented happened, something that would change the course of English history forever. A massive Viking force, larger than any that had come before, landed on the coast of East Anglia in England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it the Great Heathen Army, and that name has stuck for more than 1,000 years. It's a name that still carries weight, still evokes images of dragon-prowed ships darkening the horizon and warriors pouring ashore in their thousands. How large was this army, really? Contemporary sources are frustratingly vague on the numbers. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle just calls it great, which tells us it was bigger than usual, but not how much bigger. Modern historians have debated this question extensively, and estimates range wildly from as few as 500 men to as many as 15,000. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The most accepted estimates these days suggest the Great Heathen Army numbered in the low thousands when it first arrived, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 warriors, plus support personnel, families, and camp followers. This might not sound enormous by modern standards, but for the 9th century, it was massive. Most Viking raids up to this point had involved a few ships and a few hundred men at most. An army of several thousand, all coordinated under unified leadership, was a game changer. And who led this unprecedented force? According to the sagas and some historical sources, it was 3 of Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. Some sources also mention Björn Ironside, though his role in the English invasion is less clear than that of his brothers. What is clear is that these weren't just random raiders. They were experienced war leaders, men who'd proven themselves in battle, men who commanded loyalty and respect. The sagas tell us they came to avenge their father's death. Ragnar had been killed by King Aella of Northumbria, thrown into that pit of snakes, and his sons wanted revenge. Whether this was the actual motivation or just a convenient narrative is debatable. The Great Heathen Army brought with it not just warriors but also craftsmen, merchants, families. This wasn't a quick raid. It was an invasion, a conquest, an attempt to settle and rule. But the revenge narrative was powerful, and the Vikings used it. They told the English through messengers and emissaries, "We've come for Aella. We've come to avenge our father. Give us Aella, give us Northumbria, or face the consequences." It was psychological warfare as much as actual warfare, designed to intimidate and demoralize their enemies. The Vikings landed in East Anglia first, probably in late summer or early autumn of 865. East Anglia at this time was an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom ruled by a king named Edmund. Edmund faced an impossible situation. He had this enormous Viking army camped in his territory. He didn't have the forces to drive them out, but if he did nothing, they'd ravage his kingdom. So he tried to buy them off, or perhaps more accurately, to buy time. He provided them with horses, probably hoping they'd take their payment and leave. The horses were valuable, yes, but more importantly, they were a strategic necessity. Vikings were primarily naval warriors, but once inland they needed horses to move quickly and carry supplies. By providing horses, Edmund was essentially paying the Vikings to become more mobile and more dangerous. But what choice did he have? The Vikings, of course, took the horses and stayed. They established a base camp somewhere in East Anglia. Sources aren't precise about exactly where, and they stayed there through the winter of 865 to 66. Winter campaigns were unusual in medieval warfare. Armies typically campaigned in summer and autumn when the weather was better and food was more readily available. But the Vikings were used to harsh northern winters. They could operate year-round if they needed to, and staying through winter gave them a huge advantage. They could strike when their enemies least expected it. In the spring of 866, the Great Heathen Army rode north. They had their horses now, courtesy of Edmund. They had supplies gathered from East Anglian farms and monasteries, and they had a target, Northumbria, the kingdom where Aella ruled, where Ragnar had supposedly met his end. Northumbria at this time was in chaos. There was a civil war going on between King Osbert and a rival claimant named Aella. Yes, that Aella, the one who supposedly killed Ragnar. Whether he actually did or not almost doesn't matter. The Vikings believed he had, or at least they claimed to believe it, and they were coming for him. The civil war in Northumbria was a gift to the invaders. Instead of facing a united kingdom ready to defend itself, they found two factions more interested in fighting each other than in dealing with the Viking threat. Classic divide and conquer, except the Vikings didn't even have to do the dividing. The Northumbrians had done it to themselves. The Vikings marched on York, the capital of Northumbria, one of the most important cities in Anglo-Saxon England. York was old even by 9th century standards. It had been a Roman fortress town, Iberacum, and remnants of Roman walls still stood. After the Romans left, it became a centre of Anglo-Saxon power and culture. The Archbishop of York was one of the most important churchmen in England. The city had churches, monasteries, royal palaces, markets, and a diverse population of Angles, Saxons, and even some British and Irish. The Vikings arrived at York in November 866. They didn't bother with a long siege. They didn't need to. The city's defences, while impressive by the standards of the time, weren't designed to withstand a determined assault by several thousand warriors. And remember, the Northumbrian forces were divided, unprepared, probably still fighting each other when they should have been preparing to fight the invaders. The Vikings stormed York. It probably didn't take long. Within a day, maybe two, they'd captured the city. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it matter-of-factly. The Viking army took York, just like that, one of the most important cities in England, fallen to the invaders. King Osbert and his rival Aelle, faced with this catastrophe, finally realized they needed to work together. They put aside their differences, at least temporarily, and gathered their forces. In March of 867, they marched on York, determined to retake their capital. It was a trap, or at least it became one. The Vikings knew the Northumbrians were coming. They'd had months to prepare, to fortify their position, to plan their strategy. When Osbert and Aelle's army arrived and tried to storm the city, the Vikings were ready. The battle was fierce. The Northumbrians fought bravely, desperately. They managed to breach the walls in at least one place, got into the city, engaged in street-to-street fighting. But the Vikings had the advantage of preparation, of unified command, of sheer bloody-minded determination. They counter-attacked, drove the Northumbrians back, and turned the battle into a slaughter. Both Osbert and Aelle were killed. Different sources give different accounts of how exactly they died. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle just says they fell in battle along with much of their army. But the sagas tell a much more dramatic story. According to the tale of Ragnar's sons and other Icelandic sources, the Vikings captured Aelle alive, and then, in vengeance for Ragnar's death in the snake pit, they subjected Aelle to something called the Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle was supposedly a form of ritual execution. The victim would be restrained face down. The executioner would cut through the ribs from the back, separating them from the spine. Then the lungs would be pulled out through the opening, arranged to look like wings. Salt might be rubbed into the wounds. The whole thing was meant to resemble an eagle with its wings spread, hence the name. It's a horrifying image, and one that appears in several Norse sources. But did it actually happen? Most modern historians are skeptical. For one thing, no contemporary sources mention it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle doesn't describe Aelle's death in any unusual way, and you'd think if something this dramatic had happened, someone would have written about it at the time. For another, the Blood Eagle seems medically implausible. Could you actually perform this procedure on a living person? Would they survive long enough for it to be a meaningful torture, rather than just a quick death? Some doctors and medical historians who've looked at this say probably not. The shock and blood loss would likely kill the victim almost immediately. So why do the sagas describe it in such detail? Possibly because it sounded impressive and terrifying, and made for a good story. Possibly because there was some kernel of truth, some unusual execution method that got exaggerated over the centuries into the Blood Eagle we read about in the sources. Or possibly because the saga writers wanted to show that Ragnar's sons had avenged their father in the most brutal, final way imaginable. For whatever the truth about Aelle's specific fate, what's clear is that Northumbria fell. The Vikings installed a puppet king, a man named Egbert, who was willing to rule under their authority. York became Jorvik, a Viking city, and it would remain under Norse control for decades. The Vikings had their revenge, real or imagined, and they had a kingdom. From Northumbria, the Great Heathen Army moved south. They attacked Mercia, they laid siege to castles and monasteries. They fought the forces of Wessex under King Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great. For 14 years, this army rampaged across England, conquering, settling, establishing what would become known as the Danelaw, the region where Viking law and customs held sway. Ivar the Boneless seems to have been the primary strategist. Despite his odd nickname, which may have referred to a physical condition or simply been a kenning, meaning something entirely different, Ivar was cunning and ruthless. He negotiated when it suited him, attacked when he saw weakness, and gradually carved out a Viking kingdom in the north of England. Björn Ironside's involvement in all of this is murky. Some sources suggest he participated in the early stages of the invasion, others that he was elsewhere. What's certain is that by 862 at the latest, Björn was back in continental Europe, pursuing ambitions that would take him far beyond the shores of England. Before the Mediterranean expedition that would make him famous, Björn cut his teeth on the coasts and rivers of Francia, the Frankish kingdom that would eventually become France. He first appears in contemporary Frankish sources in 855. The Annales Bertiniani, a chronicle kept by Frankish monks, mentions a Viking named Berno, or Bjorn, who, together with another Viking chieftain named Sigtrygg, sailed up the River Seine with a large fleet. They ravaged the countryside, pillaging towns and monasteries, taking slaves and treasure. The Frankish king at this time was Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne. Charles had his hands full. His kingdom was divided. His nobles were often at each other's throats, and Viking raiders had been a persistent problem for decades. He tried various strategies to deal with them, paying them off, hiring some Vikings to fight other Vikings, fortifying key locations, building bridges across rivers to block the passage of longships. In 855, Charles gathered an army and met Björn and Sigtrygg in battle at Champagne. The Vikings were defeated, or at least checked. They withdrew, but not for long. The following year, Sigtrygg left, perhaps satisfied with the plunder he'd gained, perhaps called away to other opportunities. But Björn received reinforcements from another Viking army and returned to the Seine. This time, he was more successful. In 856–57, he launched a major assault on Paris itself. Now, Paris in the mid-9th century wasn't the sprawling metropolis we know today. It was smaller, centered on the Ile de la Cité, an island in the Seine, but it was still an important city, wealthy and symbolically significant. A Viking fleet sailing up the Seine to attack Paris was a serious threat. Björn and his men besieged the city. The details of the siege are sparse, but we know they succeeded in extracting tribute. Charles paid them off again, as he'd done before, and would do again. The Vikings withdrew, but they established a fortified base on the island of Uisel in the Seine, a stronghold from which they could launch further raids. In 858, Charles tried to broker a deal. Björn swore fealty to him, promising not to raid Frankish lands. Whether Björn kept this promise is unclear. Viking oaths were situational things, and circumstances changed rapidly. What we do know is that by 859, Björn was ready for something bigger. He'd raided England, he'd raided Francia, he'd accumulated wealth and reputation. But he wanted more. He wanted to achieve something truly extraordinary, something that would eclipse even his father's accomplishments. He wanted to raid the Mediterranean. He wanted to attack Rome itself, the heart of Christendom, the eternal city. And he was going to try. The idea of Vikings sailing into the Mediterranean might seem surprising at first. We think of them as northern warriors, creatures of cold seas and icy fjords, raiding the coasts of England and Ireland, sailing the Baltic and the North Atlantic. The warm waters of the Mediterranean seem like they should belong to a different world entirely, to Greeks and Romans, to Byzantines and Arabs, not to these northern seafarers. But Vikings were above all opportunists. They went wherever there was wealth to be plundered and glory to be won. And the Mediterranean, in the mid-9th century, was full of both. It was also, from a Viking perspective, relatively undefended against the kind of hit-and-run tactics that had served them so well in the north. Think about it from Björn's perspective. He'd raided in Francia, sailed up the Seine, fought battles with the Franks. He'd probably participated in raids on England too, though the sources aren't clear about this. He'd accumulated wealth and reputation. But these were places that other Vikings had raided before. The coasts of England and Francia were becoming familiar territory, even routine. Monasteries were being fortified, kingdoms were building navies and coastal defenses. The easy pickings were getting harder to pick, but the Mediterranean? That was new territory, at least for Vikings. There had been a few earlier raids. Some Norse warriors had made it through the Strait of Gibraltar in the past, but nothing on the scale that Björn was envisioning. This would be different. This would be an expedition that people would talk about for generations. Southern Europe and North Africa were in a state of flux in the mid-9th century. The once mighty Western Roman Empire had long since fallen, crumbled into dust and memory. In its place were various smaller kingdoms and powers, each with their own interests and conflicts. The Frankish realms dominated much of what is now France and parts of Italy. The Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, controlled parts of southern Italy and had a powerful navy in the eastern Mediterranean. The Emirate of Cordoba, a sophisticated Islamic state, ruled most of the Iberian Peninsula and had its own formidable military. And scattered throughout were various city-states, duchies, counties, each with their own fortifications and defenses. But these defenses were designed mainly to repel land armies, not seaborne raiders who could appear out of nowhere, strike quickly, and vanish back to their ships before any organized response could be mounted. There were monasteries and churches filled with treasure, just like in the north. Coastal towns conducted prosperous trade, which meant wealth concentrated in warehouses and markets, and there were slaves to be taken, always valuable in Viking economics. The Mediterranean slave trade was extensive, and Vikings could capture people and sell them either to other Europeans or to Arab merchants. For an ambitious Viking chieftain, it must have seemed like an irresistible target. The only question was, how to get there? The most direct route from Scandinavia would be to sail west around the Iberian Peninsula, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and into the Mediterranean. But this was a long, dangerous voyage, thousands of miles through often hostile waters. You'd need ships that could handle both the open Atlantic and the calmer Mediterranean. You'd need supplies for months at sea. You'd need a large enough force to be credible in battle, but small enough to be manageable. Björn wasn't going to attempt this alone. He partnered with another Viking leader, a man named Hastein or Hastein, depending on how you transliterate the Old Norse. Hastein was older, more experienced, and according to some sources may have been a sort of mentor or foster father to Björn. The relationship between them isn't entirely clear from the sources, but what is clear is that they made a formidable team. Hastein had his own impressive resume. He'd been raiding in Francia for years, had fought against Charles the Bold, had established bases along the Seine and Loire rivers. He was known for his cunning, his willingness to use deception and trickery rather than just brute force. He was exactly the kind of partner you'd want for an expedition into unknown waters. In 859, they assembled a fleet. How large was it? Sources vary, but the most commonly cited number is 62 ships. Let's think about what that means. A typical Viking longship could carry 30 to 60 men, depending on its size. 62 ships would mean a force of somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 warriors, plus all the supplies, weapons and treasure from previous raids that they were bringing with them. This wasn't a small raiding party. This was practically an army, mobile and seaborne, ready to strike anywhere along the Mediterranean coast. Gathering a fleet of this size would have been a major undertaking. You couldn't just whistle and have ships appear. Each ship had to be built or acquired, maintained, outfitted. Each warrior had to be recruited, convinced to join this risky venture into unknown waters. Why would they come? For the same reasons Vikings always went raiding: wealth, glory, adventure, the chance to prove themselves and make a name that would outlast their lives. Björn and Hastein set off from the Loire River, in what is now France. Probably in late spring or early summer of 859, the Loire was a major Viking base at this time. There were Norse settlements along the river, places where Vikings could rest, refit, trade, and plan their next moves. It was as close to a home base as the raiders had in Francia. They sailed south along the Atlantic coast, keeping land in sight most of the time. This was sensible navigation in an era before accurate maps or compasses. You followed the coastline, noted landmarks, used the sun and stars to maintain your bearing. It was slower than striking out across the open ocean, but much safer. Their first target was the Iberian Peninsula, the region that includes modern Spain and Portugal. The northern coast was controlled by the Kingdom of Asturias. a Christian realm that had survived the Islamic conquest of most of Iberia. The Asturians were tough, battle-hardened from constant warfare with their Muslim neighbors. They weren't easy targets, and indeed when Björn and Hastein's fleet arrived and attempted to raid, the Asturians repelled them. We don't have detailed accounts of this battle, but it must have been a setback. The Vikings probably expected relatively easy pickings like they'd found in Francia and England. Instead, they ran into serious resistance. They continued south, and things got worse. They encountered the forces of the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba, the powerful Islamic state that controlled most of Iberia. The Muslims had experience fighting against both Christian kingdoms and North African rivals. They had cavalry, siege engines, and perhaps most importantly for fighting Vikings, they had fire weapons. At a place called Niebla, probably on the southwestern coast of Iberia, the Muslims defeated the Viking fleet. Again, we don't have detailed accounts, but the fact that multiple sources mention this defeat suggests it was significant. The Vikings probably lost ships, men, and confidence. This wasn't going according to plan. But Björn and Hastein were nothing if not persistent. They regrouped, repaired their ships, and continued south. Eventually, they found success. They sacked the town of Algeciras on the southern coast of Spain, near the Strait of Gibraltar. And in a gesture that was both strategic and symbolic, they burned the mosque there. Why burn the mosque specifically? It wasn't just random vandalism. The Vikings were making a statement. We're not afraid of your God, your religion, your power. We can strike at your holy places, just like we strike at Christian monasteries in the north. It was psychological warfare, designed to spread fear and demonstrate that nowhere was safe from these northern raiders. From Algeciras, the fleet sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow passage between Europe and Africa, that marked the boundary between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. It must have been a momentous occasion for the Vikings. They were leaving familiar waters behind, entering a new world. The Mediterranean stretched before them, vast and full of possibilities. They raided the coast of North Africa, attacking a place called Mazima, in what was then the Idrisid Caliphate, an Islamic state in what is now Morocco. They captured slaves, took plunder, and then sailed north again to the coast of what is now southern Spain. They raided Orihuela and other towns, always moving, never staying in one place long enough for defenders to organize a proper response. Then they sailed to the Balearic Islands, that archipelago off the eastern coast of Spain. The islands were prosperous from trade and relatively lightly defended, perfect targets for Viking raiders. They pillaged settlements there, took what they wanted, and sailed on. They struck the southern coast of France, areas called Roussillon in the sources. These were regions that had probably never seen Viking raiders before. The sudden appearance of dozens of longships must have been terrifying. The Vikings took full advantage of the shock and surprise, raiding multiple settlements before the local authorities could organize any kind of response. As winter approached in 859, Björn and Hastein needed to find a place to settle temporarily. Winter sailing in the Mediterranean was dangerous, not as treacherous as the North Atlantic perhaps, but still risky enough that most mariners avoided it. Storms could arise with little warning, supplies were harder to come by, and there was the simple fact that wet, cold Vikings huddled in open boats made for a miserable and ineffective fighting force. They chose the Camargue, that curious region at the mouth of the Rhone River in southern France. The Camargue is a place of salt marshes and lagoons, of wild white horses and pink flamingos, though whether the flamingos were there in the 9th century, who can say? It was and is a liminal space, neither fully land nor fully sea, constantly shifting with the tides and the river's flow. For the Vikings, it was perfect. The marshlands provided some protection from land-based attacks. Their ships could be pulled up onto mudflats and into small channels, hidden from casual observation, and it was close enough to prosperous settlements inland that raiding remained feasible even in winter. Imagine the scene, 60-odd longships pulled up on muddy shores, their hulls settling into the soft ground. Around them, temporary shelters being erected, probably simple affairs of wood and canvas and whatever materials could be scavenged locally. Cooking fires sending smoke up into the grey winter sky, warriors maintaining their weapons, telling stories, playing dice games to pass the time. Slaves huddling together for warmth, wondering what fate awaited them. Merchants and craftsmen going about their business, because a Viking fleet was also a mobile economy. with goods to trade and equipment to maintain. The Vikings didn't just sit idle during the winter. They struck out from the Camargue, raiding far inland. This was unusual behavior, even by Viking standards. Most raiders stuck close to water, to their ships, to their line of retreat. But Björn and Hastein were bold, and they now had horses, probably captured during their earlier raids or purchased from local traders. With horses they could move quickly overland, hit targets far from the coast, and be gone before defenders could organize. They attacked Narbonne, an important city in southern France that had been a Roman settlement and was now a Frankish town. Narbonne had walls, churches, monasteries, a thriving market. The Vikings may not have captured the city itself. The walls were probably too strong for that. But they certainly ravaged the surrounding countryside, taking whatever wasn't nailed down and burning what couldn't be carried. They struck at Nimes, another old Roman city famous for its well-preserved amphitheatre and other ancient buildings. The Vikings probably cared little for architectural heritage. They wanted silver, gold, slaves, supplies. If the inhabitants resisted, buildings burned. If they paid tribute, the Vikings moved on to the next target. They raided as far as Arles, another significant city, and even reached Valence, which is a long way inland, far from the sea that was the Vikings' natural element. This speaks to their confidence, their mobility, and the weakness of local defenses. Southern France in the mid-9th century was fragmented, with local lords and bishops having limited military resources. They simply weren't prepared for this kind of mobile, aggressive raiding. Over the winter months, the Vikings accumulated a substantial amount of plunder. They also probably lost some men to disease, accidents, and the occasional skirmish with local forces. Viking expeditions weren't just about glory and wealth. They were also about attrition, about maintaining morale and discipline when you were far from home in an alien land, about managing resources and making hard decisions about when to push forward and when to consolidate. But by spring of 860, Björn and Hastein were ready to continue their expedition. Their ships had been maintained and repaired over the winter. Their men were rested, relatively speaking. They had fresh supplies and new loot to replace what they'd consumed. And they had their eyes on a bigger prize. In 860, after a winter of raiding in France, Björn and Hastein sailed east across the Ligurian Sea to Italy. They navigated along the coast, looking for targets. They found one in Pisa. Pisa at this time was a prosperous maritime city, engaged in trade across the Mediterranean. It wasn't as heavily fortified as it would become in later centuries, and the Vikings managed to capture it. They looted the city, took captives, and then sailed on. Their goal was still Rome. But here's where the story takes a turn. Whether through poor navigation, misinformation from local guides, or simple bad luck, Björn and Hastein never made it to Rome. Instead, they arrived at a coastal city called Luna, located near the border of modern-day Tuscany and Liguria. Luna had once been an important Roman town, founded in the 2nd century BC as a port for shipping marble from the nearby Apuan Alps. By the 9th century, though, it had declined significantly. The port had silted up, the population had shrunk, and it was a shadow of its former self. But it still had impressive marble buildings, ruins of Roman grandeur, and from a distance it might have looked like a major city. The Vikings, seeing these marble structures gleaming in the sun, convinced themselves they'd found Rome, the eternal city, the heart of Christendom. This was the ultimate prize. There was just one problem. Luna was heavily fortified. The walls were thick and high, and the Vikings couldn't breach them through direct assault. So Hastein, that wily, experienced raider, came up with a plan, a brilliant, devious, completely ruthless plan. He sent messengers to the Bishop of Luna with a story. Hastein, the message went, was a Viking chieftain who had been raiding across the Mediterranean. But now he was dying, and in his final days he'd seen the error of his pagan ways. He wanted to convert to Christianity. He wanted to receive the sacraments, to be baptized, and to be buried in consecrated ground within the church. The bishop, whether out of genuine Christian charity or simple naivety, believed the story. Here was a chance to save the soul of a notorious Viking warlord. How could he refuse? The gates of Luna were opened, and Hastein, supposedly on his deathbed, was carried in on a stretcher, accompanied by a small honor guard of Vikings. Some versions of the story say Hastein was brought to the church and given the last rites. Others say he claimed to have already converted and then feigned death, after which 50 of his men, disguised in robes and concealing swords, were allowed to enter for his funeral. Either way, once inside, Hastein sprang into action. He leaped from his stretcher or coffin, sword in hand, and cut down the bishop. His men threw off their robes, drew their weapons, and fought their way to the city gates. They opened the gates from the inside, and the rest of the Viking army poured in. The sack of Luna was brutal. The Vikings plundered everything of value, killed many of the male residents, and took women and children as slaves. Hastein, according to the chronicle, declared himself conqueror of Rome and demanded that all the residents pay homage to him as their new ruler. And then someone, perhaps a priest or a local official, had the unenviable task of informing Hastein that this wasn't Rome. This was Luna, a much smaller, much less significant city, hundreds of miles north of the Eternal City. You can imagine Hastein's reaction. After all that planning, all that effort, all the cunning and deception, he'd conquered the wrong city. The sagas say he was so enraged that he ordered every remaining man in Luna killed and increased the brutality of the sack. Whether he was truly that angry or whether this is embellishment, we can't say. But the story of Hastein's trick at Luna became one of the most famous Viking tales, repeated and embellished over the centuries. As for Björn, sources don't tell us much about his specific role in the Luna deception. William of Jumièges, writing in the 11th century, places him there, but gives Hastein most of the credit for the scheme. Perhaps Björn was content to let his mentor take the glory for this particular ruse. Or perhaps he was already thinking about their next move. Because even though they hadn't reached Rome, the Vikings weren't done with Italy. Not by a long shot. After Luna, Björn and Hastein continued raiding along the Italian coast. They sailed down to Fiesole, traveling up the river Arno to reach it. This was typical Viking tactics, using rivers as highways into the interior, striking at targets that thought themselves safe from seaborne raiders. They attacked other coastal settlements, always looking for plunder, always seeking to maximize their gains before the inevitable counterattack came. But before we continue with the expedition, let's pause for a moment to consider the ships that made all of this possible. Because without their vessels, without the remarkable Norse longships and the seafaring skills to sail them, none of this would have been achievable. The Viking longship is one of the most iconic vessels in maritime history. Sleek, fast, beautiful in its deadly efficiency, it was a technological marvel that gave the Vikings an enormous advantage over their enemies. These weren't just boats. They were works of art, products of centuries of accumulated knowledge and the key to Viking expansion across Europe and beyond. A typical Viking longship was maybe 20 to 30 meters long, though some were smaller and others much larger. The ship was clinker-built, meaning the hull planks overlapped each other, each plank fastened to the one below it with iron rivets. This construction method made the hull flexible, able to twist and flex with the waves rather than fighting against them. It also made the ships remarkably watertight, with wool soaked in tar or pine resin stuffed between the overlapping planks to seal the gaps. The keel, the long timber that ran the length of the ship's bottom, was cut from a single oak tree carefully selected for its straightness and lack of knots. The keel gave the ship structural strength and allowed it to sail into the wind at an angle, something that earlier vessel designs struggled with. It also meant the ship could be beached bow first and pulled back into the water easily, essential for raiders who needed to make quick landings and faster escapes. The ship was powered by both oars and sail. On a typical longship, you might have 15 to 30 pairs of oars depending on the vessel's size. Each oar was worked by a single man, and rowing was hard work. A full day of rowing could cover maybe 30 to 40 miles, exhausting the crew. But oars gave the Vikings tactical flexibility. They could row into harbors or up rivers where the wind wasn't favorable. They could maintain precise control during battles or tricky navigation, and they could move when there was no wind at all. The sail was made of wool, woven in a diamond or cross pattern for strength. A large sail might require wool from as many as 200 sheep, and weaving it was months of work, typically done by women. The sail was their most valuable piece of equipment, carefully maintained, sometimes dyed in striking colors or decorated with patterns. Red and white striped sails seem to have been popular if the sources can be trusted. Navigation in the Viking Age was both art and science. The Vikings didn't have compasses, at least not magnetic ones, though they may have used sunstones, crystals that could help determine the sun's position even on cloudy days. Mostly they navigated by observation and experience. They watched the sun and stars, the flight patterns of birds, the color and movement of waves, the drift of seaweed. They memorized landmarks, coastlines, the patterns of winds and currents. An experienced navigator could tell where he was by the water's depth, taking soundings with a weighted line and noting what came up in the tallow smeared on the weight. Sand meant one thing, shells another, different types of mud, something else again. Each seafloor texture told a story about location and proximity to land. They used something called latitude sailing. They'd sail east or west until they reached the latitude of their destination, which they could determine by the sun's angle, and then turn and sail along that latitude until they reached where they wanted to go. It was slower than sailing in a straight line would be, but far more reliable when you didn't have instruments to determine your exact position. The ships Björn and Hastein sailed to the Mediterranean were probably a mix of different types. The classic Viking longship, the Drakar or dragon ship, was primarily a warship, fast and maneuverable, but not great for carrying cargo. For an expedition that planned to be away for months and to bring back substantial plunder, they would have needed Nars as well, the broader, deeper-hulled cargo vessels that could carry tons of supplies and treasure. Think about the logistics involved in an expedition of 62 ships. You needed food and water for thousands of men for months at a time. You needed spare parts for the ships, extra oars, extra rigging, tar and wool for repairs, nails and rivets, tools. You needed weapons, armor, tents, cooking equipment, barrels for storing water and beer, all the mundane necessities of sustaining an army on the move. And this fleet had to function as a coordinated unit. Ships couldn't just scatter across the Mediterranean doing their own thing. They needed to stay together for mutual protection, to concentrate their force when attacking targets, to share information and resources. This required leadership, communication, discipline. It required Björn and Hastein to be not just warriors, but administrators, managing a complex floating community. Some sources suggest they sailed even further east, possibly reaching territories controlled by the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines were the heirs to the Eastern Roman Empire, and they had formidable naval forces. They also had access to Greek fire, a fearsome incendiary weapon that was one of the great military secrets of the medieval world. Greek fire was a liquid that burned on water. The exact composition was a closely guarded secret, lost to history when the Byzantine Empire fell, but it probably involved petroleum, resin, sulfur, and other flammable ingredients. It could be sprayed from siphons mounted on ships, creating a jet of flame that stuck to whatever it hit and couldn't be extinguished with water. For wooden ships, Greek fire was terrifying. A single shot could set a vessel ablaze, and once burning, there was little the crew could do but abandon ship. Whether the Vikings actually encountered Byzantine forces and Greek fire in the eastern Mediterranean is uncertain. But if they did, it would have been a sobering experience, a reminder that for all their skill and courage, they weren't invincible. The Mediterranean was the Byzantines' home waters. They'd been fighting naval battles here for centuries. They knew things the Vikings didn't, had weapons the Vikings couldn't counter. What is certain is that the Vikings raided across Sicily, that large island at the southern tip of Italy. Sicily was cosmopolitan, wealthy, and contested. Parts of it were controlled by the Byzantines, parts by local nobles, parts by Arab emirs. For the Vikings, this fragmentation was opportunity. They could play different factions against each other, trade with one group while raiding another, exploit the lack of unified opposition. They also crossed back to North Africa, where Hastein purchased slaves. The chronicles specifically mention Blamen, which translates to blue men. These were probably Berbers or Tuaregs from the interior of North Africa, possibly called blue men because of the indigo-dyed clothing that Tuaregs traditionally wore. Hastein planned to sell them in Ireland, where there was a thriving slave market and where Viking settlers would pay good prices for labor. By the end of 860, or perhaps early 861, Björn and Hastein had amassed an enormous amount of wealth. Their ships were laden with gold, silver, slaves, fine fabrics, weapons, armor, religious artifacts looted from churches and monasteries, artwork, anything and everything of value that they'd accumulated over more than a year of raiding. It was time to go home. The return journey would prove far more perilous than the outward voyage. They'd been lucky so far, remarkably so. They'd lost ships to battle and probably to storms and accidents, but nothing catastrophic. Their fleet was still substantial, their treasure holds full, their men blooded and confident. But their luck was about to change. As they sailed back toward the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow passage between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, they ran into a massive storm. The Mediterranean can be deceptively treacherous. Most of the time, especially in summer, it's calm, almost lake-like compared to the North Atlantic or North Sea that the Vikings were used to. But when storms hit the Mediterranean, they can be violent and unpredictable. This storm was devastating. The chronicles describe it in vivid terms, though we have to be careful about taking their numbers literally. They say 40 of the 62 ships were lost, along with all the treasure they carried and most of the men aboard them. Imagine that. After months of successful raiding, after conquering cities and accumulating fortunes, to lose 2/3 of your fleet in a single storm. Ships shattered on rocks, swamped by waves, driven far off course and lost. Men drowning by the hundreds, pulled under by the weight of their armor and weapons. Treasure chests breaking open, gold and silver sinking to the sea floor where it would lie undisturbed for centuries. The survivors must have been devastated, not just by the loss of the treasure, though that was certainly bitter, but by the loss of shipmates, friends, brothers in arms. Viking crews were tight-knit communities. You lived with these men for months or years, fought alongside them, shared hardships and victories. To watch them die, unable to help, must have been agonizing. But the survivors pressed on. What else could they do? They couldn't go back. They couldn't stay in the Mediterranean forever. Their only option was to continue toward the Strait of Gibraltar and hope to make it home with what was left. They reached the strait, but waiting for them on the other side were Andalusian forces, Muslims from the Emirate of Cordoba, who'd been tracking the Vikings' progress and were determined to stop them. The Andalusians had assembled a fleet, and critically they'd equipped it with fire weapons. These were probably not Greek fire in the sophisticated Byzantine sense, but rather fire pots, containers filled with burning oil or naphtha that could be hurled by catapults. As the Vikings tried to pass through the strait, the Andalusians attacked. The battle was fierce, the Vikings were exhausted, their fleet was already reduced, and they were up against a well-prepared, well-equipped enemy fighting in their own waters. The fire catapults were devastating. Imagine being in a wooden ship surrounded by other wooden ships, all packed close together in the narrow strait. Then suddenly, pots of burning liquid are arcing through the air, trailing smoke and flame. They smash onto decks, explode in gouts of fire. The oil splashes and spreads, sticking to wood and rope and canvas and flesh, burning with an intensity that's impossible to extinguish. Ships burst into flames. The heat is so intense that neighboring vessels catch fire too. Men scramble to escape, some diving into the water, others trying desperately to beat out flames or push burning wreckage overboard. The screams of the wounded and dying, the roar of the flames, the chaos of battle, all mixed together in a nightmare scene. The Chronicle says the Vikings lost 2 more ships to the fire catapults, though given the chaos of the battle, the real number might have been higher or lower. What's certain is that they took heavy casualties. Out of 62 ships that had set out from the Loire, only 20 made it back. 20 ships out of an original fleet of more than 60. That's a survival rate of less than 1/3. But those 20 ships still carried wealth and warriors. They carried stories, and they carried Björn and Hastein themselves, the leaders who'd conceived this audacious expedition and seen it through to the end. On the way back to France, they stopped at Pamplona, a city in what is now northern Spain. Perhaps they needed supplies. Perhaps they wanted one more raid to make up for some of what they'd lost. Perhaps they were just being Vikings, unable to pass by a tempting target. They ravaged the area around Pamplona, and then finally sailed north along the Atlantic coast back to familiar waters. They reached the Loire in 862, probably in late summer or autumn. They'd been gone for more than 3 years. In that time, they'd sailed farther than probably any Vikings before them. They'd raided across the Mediterranean, from Spain to North Africa to Italy. They'd captured cities, deceived bishops, fought storms and navies. They'd lost 2/3 of their fleet and thousands of men. But they'd survived, and they had stories that would echo through the ages. Back in the north, things had changed. Ragnar Lothbrok was dead. Whether in a snake pit in Northumbria or through some other means, his kingdom needed to be divided among his sons. According to the Hervarar saga, a 13th century Icelandic text, Björn and his brothers fought against the Swedish king Eystein Belli, the man Ragnar had appointed as his successor. In a great battle, they defeated and killed Eystein, and then they divided the conquered lands among themselves. The tale of Ragnar's sons provides more details. It says that Björn inherited Uppsala and became king of Sweden. Uppsala was, and still is, an important city in Sweden, one that held great religious and political significance in the Viking Age. To rule from Uppsala was to rule over the heartland of Swedish power. Björn Ironside then became King Björn of Sweden. This is a crucial point because if it's true, it means Björn founded a dynasty. Not just any dynasty, but what would become one of the most important royal lineages in Swedish history. This dynasty is known to historians as the Munsö dynasty, named after the island of Munsö in Lake Mälaren, where the Swedish kings of this period may have had their seat of power. It's also sometimes called the House of Uppsala, or simply the Old Dynasty. The problem is that much of what we know about this dynasty comes from sagas written centuries after the fact, and those sagas blend history with legend in ways that make it hard to separate truth from fiction. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, there was a royal dynasty in Sweden. 4 kings from this dynasty are generally accepted as historical: Eric the Victorious, Olof Skötkonung, Anund Jakob, and Emund the Old. These men ruled during the late Viking Age and into the early medieval period, and their existence is corroborated by multiple sources. Whether Björn Ironside was the actual founder of this dynasty is less certain. The sagas claim he had 2 sons, Erik Björnsson and Raefil Björnsson, both of whom became kings of Sweden after him. Erik's descendants supposedly continued to rule for generations. But again, these claims come from sources written long after the events they describe. Here's what makes it tricky. The name Björn was common in Viking Age Scandinavia. So when a 9th century Frankish chronicle mentions a Viking named Berno raiding the Seine, and a 13th century Icelandic saga mentions Björn Ironside becoming king of Sweden, we can't automatically assume they're talking about the same person. They might be, but they might not be. Contemporary sources from the 9th century do mention Swedish kings. A German missionary named Rimbert, writing in the Vita Ansgari in the 800s, describes his interactions with several Swedish rulers. He mentions a king named Björn, who ruled around 829 when the missionary Ansgar first visited Sweden. This Björn was reportedly friendly to the Christian missionaries, but chose not to convert. Was this the same Björn who raided the Mediterranean? Probably not, given the dates, but it shows there were Swedish kings named Björn during this period. The historical reality is likely this. Björn Ironside was a real Viking chieftain who raided extensively across Western Europe and the Mediterranean in the mid-9th century. He may have returned to Sweden and claimed kingship there. He may have founded a dynasty, but the specific details have been so mixed with legend over the centuries that untangling them is almost impossible. What matters, perhaps, is not just whether every detail is historically accurate, but what the legend of Björn Ironside tells us about Viking Age values and aspirations. This was a culture that valued deeds over birth, cunning over brute strength, and reputation above all. Björn, whether as historical figure or legendary hero, embodied those values perfectly. The sagas tell us very little about Björn's final years. After his triumphant return and his accession to the Swedish throne, the sources fall largely silent. There are no great battles recorded, no dramatic events. It's as if, having achieved the pinnacle of success, Björn simply faded from the historical record. This isn't surprising. Viking sagas and chronicles tended to focus on dramatic events: raids, battles, feuds, betrayals. Peaceful rule was less interesting from a narrative perspective. So if Björn spent his final years governing Sweden, administering justice, managing trade relations, and generally keeping his kingdom stable, the chroniclers might not have bothered to record it. Some sources suggest Björn lived to old age, dying peacefully in his bed. For a Viking warrior, this was not the most glorious end. The ideal death was in battle, weapon in hand, earning a place in Valhalla. But perhaps, after a lifetime of raiding and warfare, Björn was content with a quieter end. According to tradition, he was buried on the island of Munsö in Lake Mälaren, not far from the modern city of Stockholm. The island contains a burial field with numerous mounds and stone settings, dating from the Vendel period through the Viking Age. The largest of these mounds, a structure 20 meters in diameter and 5 meters tall, was identified by 18th century antiquarians as Björn Ironside Hög, or Björn Ironside's mound. Is this really where Björn was laid to rest? Modern historians are skeptical. The attribution was made without any real archaeological evidence, and the burial practices of the time make it difficult to confirm. The mound may contain the remains of a significant chieftain or king, but whether that person was Björn Ironside specifically, we simply don't know. What we do know is that Viking burials, especially for important people, were elaborate affairs. The dead were often buried with grave goods, weapons, jewelry, sometimes even ships. The idea was that they'd need these things in the afterlife. A king would be buried with his finest possessions, surrounded by symbols of his power and achievements. If the Munsö mound is indeed Björn's burial place, one can imagine what it might have contained. His sword, the weapon that had served him through countless battles, perhaps a ship, or at least a boat, to carry him to the next world. Treasure from his Mediterranean raids, gold and silver and precious stones, and runestones perhaps carved with his deeds, so that future generations would remember what he'd accomplished. But the mound, if it was ever opened in ancient times, has long since been emptied. Grave robbers in the medieval period or later would have taken anything of value. What remains is the mound itself, a grassy hill overlooking the lake, a marker in the landscape that says someone important was buried here. So who was the real Björn Ironside? That's the question that historians have been trying to answer for over 1,000 years. And the answer, frustratingly, is, we're not entirely sure. Let's look at what we have. Contemporary sources from the 9th century mention a Viking named Berno or Björn, who raided the Seine in the 850s. The Annales Bertiniani and the Chronicon Fontanellense, both Frankish chronicles written by monks who lived through the Viking raids, record these events. These are generally considered reliable sources for the basic facts. Yes, there was a Viking leader named something like Björn. Yes, he raided Francia. Yes, he was active in the mid-9th century. Then we have William of Jumièges, writing around 1070 in his Gesta Normanorum Ducum, or Deeds of the Norman Dukes. William describes the Mediterranean expedition in some detail. He identifies Björn Ironside as the leader, alongside his foster father Hastein. He tells the story of the sack of Luna, though he doesn't include all the supernatural or legendary elements that appear in later sources. William was writing about 200 years after the events, so his account is not contemporary, but it's still relatively early, and considered somewhat reliable. Then we jump to the 13th century, to the Icelandic sagas. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, the tale of Ragnar's sons, and various other texts expand the story considerably. They give us Björn's parentage, his brothers, his relationship with his father, his kingship in Sweden, his dynasty. But these were written 300 to 400 years after the events they describe. They're based on oral traditions, yes, but oral traditions that had been shaped and reshaped over the centuries, mixing historical memory with legend and invention. Saxo Grammaticus, writing his Gesta Danorum around 1200, provides yet another version. He gives us the origin of the Ironside nickname and places Björn in various battles and adventures, some of which conflict with other sources. So what do we do with all this? Modern historians take a critical approach. They start with the contemporary sources as the most reliable, then work outward, using later sources cautiously and trying to identify what might be historical core versus legendary elaboration. Here's what most historians would agree on. There was a Viking leader named Björn who was active in the mid to late 9th century. He raided extensively in Francia and likely participated in the Mediterranean expedition of 859 to 862. He was associated with other prominent Vikings like Hastein and possibly with the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, who led the Great Heathen Army. Beyond that, things get murkier. Was he the son of Ragnar Lothbrok? Possibly, but Ragnar himself is semi-legendary, so that doesn't help much. Did he become king of Sweden? Maybe. Did he found a dynasty that ruled for centuries? The later kings of Sweden certainly existed, but whether they were actually descended from Björn is impossible to prove. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Björn Ironside was likely based on one or more real Viking chieftains whose exploits were impressive enough to be remembered and retold. Over the centuries, as stories were passed down orally and then eventually written down, details were added, changed, enhanced. The historical Björn and the legendary Björn became intertwined, creating the figure we know today. And honestly, that's okay, because legends serve a purpose beyond simple historical accuracy. They tell us what a culture values, what it aspires to, what it considers worthy of remembering. The legend of Björn Ironside tells us that the Vikings valued courage and cunning in equal measure, that they admired those who dared to go beyond the known world, who took risks and sought glory. That reputation and renown were the ultimate achievements, worth more than gold or land. Björn Ironside's influence extended far beyond his own lifetime, assuming he lived into his old age as King of Sweden, or died younger in Frisia, as some sources claim. His story, whether entirely factual or not, became part of the Viking cultural heritage. In medieval Scandinavia, his name would have been invoked as an example of Viking excellence. Skalds, the old Norse poets, might have composed verses about his exploits. Parents might have told their children about Björn Ironside, the man whose sides were like iron, who sailed to the ends of the known world and conquered cities in the warm south. The dynasty he allegedly founded, the Munse or Uppsala line, became one of the most important in Swedish history. Even if we can't trace a direct genealogical line back to Björn himself, the idea of that connection mattered. Medieval kings liked to claim descent from legendary heroes. It legitimized their rule, gave them prestige, connected them to a glorious past. By the time the Icelandic sagas were being written in the 13th century, Björn had become a standard character in the legendary history of the North. He appears not just in the Ragnar sagas, but in other texts as well, usually in a heroic light. He's the skilled warrior, the adventurous raider, the wise king. This legendary version of Björn influenced how later generations understood the Viking Age. When interest in Old Norse culture was revived in the 18th and 19th centuries during the Romantic period, figures like Björn Ironside were rediscovered and celebrated. Artists painted scenes of his adventures. Writers incorporated him into novels and plays. He became part of the broader cultural mythology of the Vikings. In the 21st century, Björn Ironside experienced yet another revival, this time through popular media. The television series Vikings, which ran from 2013 to 2020, featured Björn as one of the main characters, played by actor Alexander Ludwig. This version of Björn was the son of Ragnar and the shield maiden Lagertha, not Aslaug, as the sagas tell it. He was portrayed as the eldest son, with a complex relationship with his half-brother Ivar. The show took considerable liberties with the historical sources, as all dramatic adaptations do, but it introduced millions of viewers around the world to the story of Björn Ironside. It sparked renewed interest in Viking history and culture, and it demonstrated once again the enduring power of these ancient stories. What's fascinating is how each generation reimagines Björn for its own time. The medieval saga writers portrayed him as an ideal Viking, brave, cunning, and dynasty founding. The Romantic-era scholars saw him as a symbol of Nordic greatness and cultural heritage. Modern media presents him as a complex, flawed human being, struggling with family dynamics and moral choices while still being fundamentally heroic. All of these versions tell us as much about the people doing the retelling as they do about the historical Björn. And that's part of what makes these legends so valuable. They're not just about the past, they're about how we relate to the past, what we choose to remember and why. Let's return for a moment to that mound on the island of Munster. Whether or not it actually contains the remains of Björn Ironside, it's worth considering what it represents. The mound sits in a burial field that contains about 150 ancient remains, smaller mounds, stone settings, rune stones. The largest mound has been weathered by time, overgrown with grass and trees. There's no sign or plaque marking it as Björn's grave. Unlike some of the more famous Viking burial sites in Scandinavia, if you didn't know what you were looking for, you might walk right past it. But according to local tradition going back to the 1700s, this is where the great warrior king was laid to rest. In the early 18th century, when Swedish antiquarians were beginning to take an interest in Viking Age archaeology, they surveyed the burial mounds on Munster and identified the largest one as Björn Ironside Hög, based on, well, not much more than the fact that it was the largest and most impressive mound there. The logic went something like this. The sagas say Björn became king of Sweden and founded the Munster dynasty. There's a big burial mound on Munster. Therefore, that must be where Björn was buried. It's not the most rigorous archaeological reasoning, but it stuck. Modern scholars are much more cautious. Without excavating the mound and finding some kind of identifying inscription or artifact, which would require disturbing what might be a grave, there's no way to know for certain who's buried there. And even if we did excavate and found rich grave goods consistent with a 9th century king, we still couldn't prove it was Björn specifically, rather than some other important chieftain. But here's the thing. In a way, it doesn't matter. The mound, whoever it actually contains, serves as a physical connection to the Viking Age. It's a place where you can stand and look out over Lake Mälaren and imagine what it might have been like in Björn's time. The longships pulled up on the shore, the great halls where warriors feasted, the thing, or assembly, where free men gathered to make laws and settle disputes. The island of Munster was an important place in the Viking Age. Excavations have found evidence of a significant settlement there, with craft workshops, trading posts, and connections to the wider Viking world. Artifacts from as far away as the Middle East have been discovered, suggesting that whoever lived on Munster was engaged in long-distance trade. Was Björn one of those who lived and ruled there? It's possible. It fits with what the sagas tell us. But even if he wasn't, even if the whole connection between Björn and Munster is a later invention, the archaeology tells us that this was a place of power and wealth during the Viking Age. Someone important was buried in that mound, someone whose death was significant enough that a huge amount of labor was expended to raise a monument to them. Viking burial mounds were more than just graves. They were statements. They were ways of claiming the land, of asserting that our people have been here, our great leaders rest in this soil, this is our territory. They were also, in a very real sense, investments in memory. The larger and more impressive the mound, the more likely it was that people would remember the person buried there. And in that sense, whether the Munster mound is actually Björn's grave or not, it has succeeded. We're still talking about it, more than 1,000 years later. We're still wondering who lies beneath that grassy hill. The mound has preserved, if not the man himself, then at least the idea of him. Near the Munster burial mound stands a rune stone, though it's fragmentary and weathered. The inscription is partially legible. It seems to be a memorial, as most rune stones were, though to whom is no longer entirely clear. It reads something like the "Thou Ragutter, you breath and God." Not much to go on. But it's a reminder that the Vikings, despite not having a widespread literary culture during most of the Viking Age, did have ways of preserving memory. Rune stones were raised to commemorate important people and events. They stood in public places where travelers would see them and remember. Some of the most famous rune stones in Sweden mention the Viking expeditions to the east, to the lands that would become Russia. Others commemorate warriors who died in England or traders who perished far from home. They're brief, often formulaic, but they give us glimpses into the lives and concerns of people who lived more than 1,000 years ago. If there was ever a runestone specifically commemorating Björn Ironside, it hasn't survived, or at least hasn't been identified. But the stones that do survive tell us about a world in which Björn would have been entirely at home. A world of journeys and warfare, of loyalty and reputation, of remembering the dead and ensuring their deeds weren't forgotten. The sagas served a similar function, though they were composed and transmitted orally long before being written down. They were entertainment, yes, but they were also cultural memory. They taught moral lessons, preserved genealogies, explained why things were the way they were. When a saga teller recounted the story of Björn Ironside and his Mediterranean raid, he wasn't just telling an exciting adventure story. He was teaching his audience about courage and cleverness, about the importance of seeking glory, about the consequences of ambition. The fact that these stories were embellished and elaborated over time doesn't diminish their value. If anything, it shows how important they were. People cared enough about these tales to keep telling them, to adapt them to new circumstances, to preserve them through the chaos of the medieval period, until they could finally be written down. And once they were written down, in those beautiful illuminated manuscripts produced in Iceland in the 13th and 14th centuries, they became part of world literature. Scholars across Europe began to take notice. The sagas were translated into Latin, then into modern European languages. Björn Ironside and his fellow legendary Vikings became known far beyond Scandinavia. Today, Björn Ironside is more famous than he's perhaps ever been, thanks to the global reach of modern media. The Vikings television series alone has been viewed by tens of millions of people worldwide. It sparked a renewed fascination with Viking culture, leading to increased tourism to Scandinavian historical sites, more academic research into the Viking Age, and a proliferation of Viking-themed books, games, and other media. But this modern interest comes with complications. The Vikings have been claimed by various groups for various purposes over the centuries. 19th century nationalists in Scandinavia used them to promote ideas of racial purity and Nordic superiority. In the 20th century, the Nazis appropriated Viking imagery for their own terrible ends. Today, some far-right and white supremacist groups continue to misuse Viking symbols and mythology. This is deeply problematic, not least because it's historically inaccurate. The Vikings were not racially pure. They intermarried with the people they encountered, from Ireland to Russia. They traded with the Islamic world, with Byzantium, with cultures across Europe and beyond. Their society was hierarchical and often brutal, yes, but it was also pragmatic and adaptable. They weren't the blonde-haired, blue-eyed warriors of Nazi propaganda, but a diverse group of Scandinavian peoples with complex motivations and relationships. Modern scholars and enthusiasts are working to reclaim Viking history from these distortions. They emphasize the diversity of Viking Age society, the important roles women played, the sophistication of Viking arts and crafts, the far-reaching trade networks. They point out that while Vikings could be brutal raiders, they were also skilled traders, craftsmen, farmers, and explorers. Björn Ironside, in this context, becomes a more nuanced figure. Not a simple hero or villain, but a product of his time. A man who lived in a violent age and participated in that violence, but who also showed remarkable courage, strategic thinking, and ambition. A leader who could inspire loyalty in his followers and fear in his enemies. He was, in other words, human, flawed and complex, capable of both cunning deception and straightforward bravery, motivated by a mix of greed, ambition, duty to his family, and desire for lasting fame. There's something universal about Björn's story that transcends the specific details of 9th century Scandinavia. It's a story about exploration, about pushing boundaries, about daring to venture into the unknown. These are themes that resonate across cultures and time periods. When Björn and Hastein set sail for the Mediterranean, they were leaving behind everything familiar. They were voyaging into waters that few, if any, Vikings had sailed before. They didn't have accurate maps. They didn't know what they'd encounter. They were, in a very real sense, heading into the unknown. This spirit of adventure is something we still celebrate today. When we send spacecraft to explore other planets, when we dive to the deepest parts of the ocean, when we push the boundaries of human knowledge and capability, we're echoing what Björn did more than 1,000 years ago. The scale is different, the technology is different, but the fundamental impulse is the same: to see what's over the horizon, to test ourselves against new challenges, to leave a mark that will be remembered. Of course, Björn's expeditions had a darker side. He was a raider, not an explorer in the modern sense. He went to plunder, not to discover or learn. The people he attacked, the cities he sacked, the slaves he took, these were real human costs. It's important not to romanticize that aspect of Viking culture. But within his own cultural context, Björn was doing what was expected and admired. Viking society valued martial prowess and the ability to acquire wealth through raiding. This was how young men proved themselves, how they gained the resources to establish their own households, how they built the reputation that would live on after their deaths. We can acknowledge this reality, while still recognizing that by modern standards these actions were violent and destructive. History is full of such contradictions. Most historical figures, if we're honest about them, were products of their time, with values and behaviors that we might find troubling today. What matters is that we try to understand them in their context, while also recognizing how far we've come. We don't sail to foreign shores to raid and plunder anymore. We've developed different ways of achieving glory and leaving legacies. But we can still appreciate the courage and ambition of people like Björn, even as we reject the violence that often accompanied those qualities. Björn Ironside. Even the name carries weight. In Old Norse it was Björn Ironside. Björn means bear, a powerful animal that the Norse both feared and revered. Bears were symbols of strength and ferocity. To be named bear was to be identified with those qualities from birth. And Ironside, Ironside. Iron was precious in the Viking Age. It had to be smelted from ore, a labor-intensive process. Iron weapons and tools were valuable, carefully maintained, sometimes given names of their own. To have sides of iron meant to be as hard and unyielding as that metal, to be a warrior who couldn't be easily wounded or defeated. Names mattered in Viking culture. They carried meaning, conferred identity, could even shape destiny. A good name, a strong name, was something to live up to. And if you earned a nickname through your deeds, as Björn apparently did, that became part of your identity, part of how you'd be remembered. Think about the other figures from this era whose nicknames have survived. Ivar the Boneless, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Eric Bloodaxe, Harold Bluetooth. Each name tells a story, hints at something notable about the person. Some of these nicknames are clear in their meaning, others mysterious, but all of them serve to make these historical figures more memorable, more distinct. Björn Ironside stands among them, one of the great names of the Viking Age. And whether the man behind the name was exactly as the sagas describe, or somewhat different, or a composite of several people, doesn't change the fact that the name itself has power. It evokes an image, a warrior in the thick of battle, seemingly invulnerable, fighting with the strength and ferocity of a bear and the hardness of iron. That image has endured for more than 11 centuries. It will likely endure for centuries more. So here we are at the end of our journey through Björn Ironside's life and legend. We've sailed from the fjords of Scandinavia to the streets of Paris, from the shores of England to the marble cities of Italy. We've witnessed battles and storms, cunning schemes and desperate fights. We've seen empires rise and fall, kings come and go, and through it all the figure of Björn, sometimes clear, sometimes shadowy, but always present. What can we say with certainty? Not as much as we'd like. The historical record is fragmentary, the sagas are unreliable, and the man himself has been dead for more than 1,000 years. We know there was a Viking named Björn, or something similar, who raided in Francia and possibly the Mediterranean in the mid-9th century. We know he was associated with other prominent Vikings of his day. We know his name was remembered and his deeds celebrated in later sources. Beyond that, we're in the realm of probability and possibility rather than certainty. Probably he was part of the Lothbrok family in some way, though whether as an actual son of Ragnar or as someone who claimed that connection for political reasons we can't say. Possibly he became king of Sweden and founded a dynasty, though the evidence is thin. Almost certainly his story was embellished and elaborated over the centuries as it was passed down. But here's what we can say without reservation. Björn Ironside, whether as historical figure or legendary hero, represents something important about the Viking Age and about human nature more broadly. He represents ambition, the desire to achieve great things and be remembered for them. He represents courage, the willingness to face danger and uncertainty in pursuit of one's goals. And he represents the enduring power of stories, the way that tales told around fires or written in sagas can preserve memory and meaning across the centuries. In a sense, Björn has achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. His name is remembered. His deeds, real and legendary, are still recounted. People still tell his story, still visit the places associated with him, still wonder about the man behind the myth. That's a kind of immortality. Not the literal immortality of Valhalla that the Vikings believed in, but something perhaps even more powerful, living on in the memory and imagination of generations yet unborn. The wind whispers across Lake Mälaren, ruffling the waters and stirring the grass that covers the ancient burial mound. Whether Björn Ironside lies beneath that earth or elsewhere, or nowhere at all, the mound stands as testament to an age when warriors sailed in longships and carved their names across the face of Europe. Somewhere beneath the Mediterranean waves lie the wrecks of those 40 ships lost in the storm, their treasures scattered across the sea floor. Somewhere in the stone and soil of Luna are the scars of the Viking attack, buried under centuries of building and rebuilding. Somewhere in the genetic heritage of modern Europeans are the descendants of those Vikings who raided and settled, who intermarried with local populations and became part of the fabric of medieval society. The Viking Age ended more than 900 years ago. The longships rotted, the great halls burned or crumbled, the old gods gave way to Christianity, and the raiders became farmers and townspeople. But the stories lived on. They were told and retold, written down and preserved, adapted and reimagined. And so Björn Ironside sails on, through the collective memory of humanity, across the sea of time. His ships may be gone, his sword rusted to nothing, his bones dust. But the idea of him, the legend of him, remains as strong and resilient as iron. As you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you can see him, a bear of a man in the prow of a longship, salt spray on his face, eyes fixed on a distant horizon. Perhaps you can hear the creak of oars, the snap of a sail, the battle cry of warriors heading into the unknown. Perhaps you can feel, just for a moment, that same call to adventure that drove the Vikings from their homes and into legend. Sleep well, dream of distant shores and ancient days, and if you enjoyed this journey through history and myth, well, you know what to do. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Until next time, when we'll explore another corner of mythology and legend, I'll leave you with this. The Vikings believed that a person dies twice. Once when their heart stops beating, and once when their name is spoken for the last time. By that measure, Björn Ironside is very much alive. His name is still spoken. His story is still told, and it will be told as long as there are people who hunger for tales of adventure and glory, of courage and cunning, of raiders who became legends. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the sound of the sea and the call of distant horizons.